It starts on a quiet stretch of road where the trees cast long shadows and the air holds its breath. An old man rides alone, leather jacket, steel gray hair, silence in his posture. Not calm, just used to being unseen. Then come the lights, the slow command, the hard grip. And suddenly he's not a name or a history, just a question no one wants to answer. But this time someone is watching, and the silence doesn't last. This story is not just about one moment, it's about how dignity bends before it breaks, and what happens when someone decides they've had enough. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now in your corner of the world? Let us know in the comments and stay with us, because what comes next matters. The sky was still the color of ash when Elliot Wade stepped out onto the porch, the air crisp enough to bite gently at the skin. A thin mist clung to the tops of the trees, and somewhere deep in the woods, a mourning dove called once then went silent. He stood there for a moment in his worn flannel shirt and jeans, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam curling past his knuckles as the scent of dark roast coffee filled the quiet. At 72, Elliot had learned to read mornings like maps. This one was clear, and still the kind that carried no warnings on the surface, only echoes underneath if you listened close enough. He took a long sip, let the heat settle into his chest, and exhaled through his nose like he was preparing for something, though what he couldn't say. The Triumph sat where it always did in the old wooden garage, a little crooked from the uneven gravel, its chrome dulled in places but still proud, like the man who'd been riding it for over 40 years. He walked toward it with a kind of ritual silence, his boots crunching through damp leaves, fingers flexing slightly from the stiffness in his knuckles. His hand brushed the seat as he passed leather worn smooth as riverstone, before reaching for the garage handle and pulling the door open. Inside, the air smelled of oil, dust, and old metal. The kind of place where every object had a story, even if no one asked anymore. Elliot didn't mind. He liked the quiet of things that didn't talk back, that waited for his hands to bring them to life. The first thing he did was roll up the sleeves of his flannel, revealing wrists lined with veins and faded scars. Then he lifted the canvas tarp off the motorcycle in one practiced motion. "Morning, girl," he said quietly, running his palm along the tank like he was greeting an old friend. "Still got some miles in you, don't you?" He moved methodically, checking the tires, the oil, the throttle cables. The kind of checklist that had long ago stopped being necessary and had become more like a prayer, a way to steady his mind. Each movement was slow but sure, his breath steady, even when his back protested or his shoulder locked up for a moment, like an old hinge. He didn't curse or groan. He simply paused, let the pain pass, then kept going. After 30 years in the Army, after all those years of shouting drills and marching cadets through rain and dust, Elliot Wade had earned the right to do things at his own pace. He set the coffee down on the workbench and pulled out a rag to wipe the mirrors, his reflection glinting back at him in fragments, gray eyes, close-cropped hair, a brow that had never really softened. Then the phone rang sharp and sudden in the quiet, breaking the trance. He pulled it from his pocket, squinting slightly at the screen before answering. "Hey, baby girl," he said, his voice softening immediately. On the other end, his daughter Monica sounded half awake but no less concerned. "You heading out already?" she asked, the sound of her voice crackling slightly through the speaker. He smiled as he sat on the stool beside the bike. "You know I am," he replied. Skies clear, roads waiting. There was a pause, just long enough for him to sense the hesitation. "I know you love that ride, Daddy," she said, "but just be careful, okay? Some places down there still don't look kindly on black men with nice things." Elliot chuckled once, low and short, not because it was funny, but because he knew it wasn't. "I've been riding that road since before you were born," he said, picking up the rag again. "Ain't no curve, I don't know." She didn't laugh. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone," she said. "You've earned peace." He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I'm not proving anything," he said. "Just visiting some old friends. I'll call you when I get back." She sighed again. He knew that sound well, the one that lived somewhere between pride and worry, but she let him go. "All right. Love you, Daddy." "Love you too, baby girl," he said, then hung up. Outside, the sun had begun to stretch across the treetops, bathing the edges of the road in gold. He wheeled the bike out of the garage, slowly taking care not to slip on the damp gravel. The Triumph came alive on the second kick, coughing once, then purring like it had never aged a day. Elliot swung one leg over the saddle, settled into the seat, and adjusted the helmet strap under his chin. No military badges, no patches, no sign of what he'd done or who he'd once been. Just a man and a machine, and the silence of a road that hadn't yet told its story. He looked once toward the tree line, then down the road that wound like a snake through the hills, remembering where it would dip near the creek rise just past the cotton fields and level out before the old general store. The memories came not in sharp flashes, but as slow waves, men saluting boots in formation faces he hadn't seen in decades but still carried with him. He twisted the throttle gently, feeling the vibration through his boots, the shiver of power he never quite stopped loving. And then he was off. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just the low rumble of an engine slicing through morning stillness and the figure of an old man riding into what should have been another quiet Sunday. Elliot had just passed the last gas station before the two-lane highway bent toward the open hills when the cruiser pulled in behind him, silent and steady. No lights yet, just that unmistakable posture of a vehicle sizing you up. The sound of tires against gravel faded beneath the low hum of his Triumph as he glanced once in the mirror, not nervous, just aware, because men like him had long since learned the difference between being watched and being followed. The road was empty except for the black and white car, and though the morning still held its calm, something in his gut shifted like the weather turning just beyond the horizon. He didn't speed up or slow down, just kept his pace at 45, knowing he was well under the limit, knowing there was nothing about his ride that warranted attention, except maybe the color of the man on it. The cruiser lingered for another mile, then flashed its lights once sharp and sudden like a slap on the shoulder. Elliot eased off the throttle, signaled, and pulled to the side of the road where the grass was cut short, and the air smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth. He flipped the kickstand down, took off his helmet slowly, and waited without turning around posture, upright hands resting calmly on the handlebars like a man who's done this before and knows how not to give anyone an excuse. A car door opened and slammed shut. With a force that wasn't just physical, it carried something else, a tension that came from inside the man stepping out. Officer Trent Callahan was in his late 30s, stocky and tight-jawed, the kind of man whose belt always looked like it was carrying more than just equipment. He approached with heavy strides, hand already resting near his sidearm, eyes locked on Elliot's back like he expected a threat from a 72-year-old who hadn't moved an inch. Behind him, the passenger side door opened with less force, and a younger man stepped out. Deputy Liam Ross, still new to the job, slower in his walk, more cautious in his gaze. "Take off your helmet and keep your hands where I can see them," Callahan said, his voice clipped, and practiced the kind of tone designed to control a situation before it ever needed controlling. Elliot turned his head, slightly nodded once, and said, "Already done, officer," lifting the helmet gently and placing it on the gas tank both hands, then returning to rest in plain sight. He didn't move fast, didn't ask questions. He just waited, because he knew from experience that asking too early, too directly, could shift a man like Callahan from suspicion to anger without warning. Callahan stood in front of the bike, now eyes moving over the chrome, the leather, the clean lines of a machine clearly owned and cared for. "Nice ride," he said, though it didn't sound like a compliment. "Not something I see folks like you riding around here often." Elliot met his eyes for the first time, steady and unblinking, then said calmly, "I've had her since '81. She's got some history." Ross shifted slightly to the side, watching both men, his fingers resting against his duty belt. Not in fear, just uncertainty. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Callahan ordered, still standing, stiff and square, like a man waiting to be contradicted. "May I ask what I was stopped for?" Elliot said, his voice level. No heat in it, only the clear weight of someone asking not out of defiance, but expectation of an answer. Callahan's jaw flexed. "Got a call about a string of bike thefts in the county. Yours matches the description." Elliot blinked once. A 40-year-old British bike. Callahan didn't respond to the logic, just lifted his chin slightly. "You got the paperwork or not?" Elliot nodded, eyes calm. "I do. Inside my jacket. Left side. I'll move slowly." Callahan gave a short nod, but his hand twitched toward the holster. Ross noticed and said quietly but firmly, "He's complying." Elliot reached into his jacket with slow precision, the same way he used to disarm tripwires. No sudden moves, no room for misunderstanding. He pulled out his wallet, flipped it open, and offered his license. Callahan snatched it, glanced down, didn't say a word, just kept looking at the name like he was trying to place it, then waved vaguely. "Registration and insurance now." "It's under the seat," Elliot said. "I'll need to lift it." Callahan stepped closer. "Do it slow." Elliot shifted his weight, knelt beside the bike, and unlatched the compartment. As he opened it, his sleeve shifted slightly, revealing a faint scar on his forearm faded. Pale, the kind that doesn't come from accidents but from something earned in places most men don't talk about. Inside the seat compartment, neatly folded, were the documents he needed alongside an old flag in a protective sleeve and a military patch tucked between two cloth rags. He handed over the papers, then sat back down without being told, letting the morning air cool the sweat beginning to bead at his temples. Callahan looked through the documents, but it was clear from his stance that he wasn't satisfied with what he saw, even though everything matched. "Where you headed?" he asked. Elliot exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "Memorial ride. My wife's buried out near Wilkins Ridge. We served together." Callahan's mouth tightened. "You're a vet," Elliot nodded. 30 years. Doesn't say that on your license." Elliot didn't respond. He wasn't about to unfold his life story on the side of a country road for a man who'd made up his mind before the car had even stopped. But something shifted then. Something fell from his wallet when he took it out, something small and laminated. Callahan's boot tapped it, then froze. Ross saw it too. "That's a military ID," he said, stepping forward. "Looks legit." Callahan glanced down, then kicked it away under the bike like it didn't matter. "Could be fake," he muttered. "Lot of folks play soldier to get sympathy." Elliot flinched slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, something like insult, wearing the clothes of ignorance. He looked at Ross, who hesitated, then looked away. The silence was thick now, the kind that lives in the seconds before something goes wrong. Callahan leaned in. "I'm going to need to secure you while I check this out," he said. "Standard procedure." Elliot didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just said, "This isn't about the bike, is it?" And when Callahan grabbed his arm and yanked it behind his back, Elliot stumbled forward, slightly pain blooming in his shoulder like a memory. "Careful," Ross said quickly, stepping in now clearly unsettled. But Callahan was past hearing. He had what he thought was authority, and that was all he needed. Elliot didn't speak again. He didn't beg or plead. He simply looked at the ground as the handcuffs clicked, closed, and the silence around him grew heavier than the steel biting into his wrists. Sarah Chen had just finished her shift at the hospital, the kind that leaves your bones humming and your mind soft around the edges, when she turned onto County Route 8 and noticed the flash of red and blue reflected across the windshield. At first, she thought little of it, just another traffic stop on a quiet road, maybe someone rolling through a stop sign or going 10 over. But as she approached the bend, something about the way the scene unfolded didn't sit right with her. There was no other traffic, no backup arriving, just two officers and an older black man in handcuffs standing with his back to the road and blood trickling slowly down the side of his face. She slowed the car without thinking, pulled to the shoulder, and kept the engine running as she angled herself to see better through the passenger side window. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a second, then unlocked it, not out of drama or instinct, but out of a quiet unease that had settled in her chest like a stone. She didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. There was tension in the way the older man stood, shoulders squared, but unmoving, the kind of posture that spoke of dignity, clashing against something colder, something that refused to see it. Without saying a word, she angled her phone just so, tilted it slightly to reduce glare, and began recording. The screen framed the two officers, one rigid and aggressive, the other hovering near the patrol car like he wasn't sure if he belonged in the frame. The older man stood between them, unmoving now as the taller officer shoved him again, this time harder until his head hit the cruiser with a soft, sickening thud. Sarah gasped but didn't move. She knew too well that sometimes bearing witness was the most dangerous and most necessary thing a person could do. "Come on," she whispered to no one, thumb brushing the screen to begin a live broadcast, her voice steady but low, like she was talking to a friend across the table. "This is happening right now. Middle of Route 8, just past the creek. Black man probably in his 70s bleeding. They've got him in cuffs. The numbers on the screen started small. 4 viewers, then 7, then 11, but climbed steadily as hashtags connected notifications pinged and people with networks wider than hers started resharing what they saw. She didn't move the camera. She didn't speak again. She just held the lens steady and let the silence of the man in handcuffs speak louder than anything she could say. Half a state away in a small military facility where drills were winding down for the weekend, Captain Aaron Briggs had just come off the field when his phone vibrated twice in quick succession. He almost ignored it, but something made him glance down, and when he saw the thumbnail on the screen, an old man against a cruiser, wrists locked, head bleeding, it knocked the air from his lungs before he even registered the name. He tapped the link, and the video opened to show the exact posture, the precise stance of the man who'd taught him everything about standing tall under pressure. It took less than 5 seconds for him to whisper, "That's him." The soldiers around him turned when they heard the change in his voice. Who, one of them asked, and Briggs didn't hesitate. "That's Sergeant Major Wade. That's my mentor." He turned the screen around, the footage still rolling, and that officer's got his damn hands on him. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then Briggs raised his voice slightly and said, "Get Major Davis on the phone. I want a full read on local jurisdiction, and I want it now." The chain of reaction was almost surgical orders, delivered clean and crisp radios, crackling boots moving across gravel in synchronized rhythm. Briggs didn't raise his voice again, didn't need to. The memory of Elliot Wade standing on the training field, calling out cadets by name, correcting posture, demanding clarity of mind before clarity of weapon carried weight that no badge could outshine. "He taught us what it meant to carry authority without becoming it," Briggs said quietly, almost to himself. "And now someone's treating him like he's less than nothing. That ends today." Back on Route 8, Sarah could see the older man's breathing change, not panic, just deeper, slower, like he was holding something in with every inhale. The officer who had done the shoving leaned in close mouth, moving just out of earshot, but his posture was unmistakably hostile. Sarah's hand trembled for a moment, then steadied again. She adjusted her angle, catching the officer's profile, then the drops of blood on the cruiser's hood, then the younger deputy, who still hadn't intervened. Inside her chest, a quiet storm brewed. Not fear, not yet, but something more urgent. The knowledge that if she didn't keep the camera steady, the story could shift without record. She whispered again, this time more to herself than anyone watching, "Stay standing. Just a little longer. Help's coming." And somewhere behind her, far enough away to be a rumor, came the distant sound of diesel engines, slow, deep, and in formation. She didn't look yet. She just kept filming because the moment hadn't finished speaking, and she knew better than to interrupt a man's dignity in the moment it was being tested. Captain Aaron Briggs stood in the middle of the motor pool with the weight of command pressing against his chest like armor that didn't quite fit anymore, his jaw set and eyes locked on the row of Humvees, lined up like sleeping giants under the gray mid-morning sky. The clip from the live stream had burned into his mind, not just because of what he'd seen, but because of who it was. Elliot Wade standing bloodied and handcuffed beside a patrol car, like he was a stranger to dignity, like the 30 years he gave to this country could be washed away by one man's ignorance in uniform. Briggs didn't need to explain to his team why they were moving out. Most of them had trained under Wade too, and those who hadn't had heard the stories told in low tones with the kind of reverence reserved for men who lead by example, not just by rank. The soldiers gathered quickly, word spreading like a silent current through the barracks, not carried by official orders but by something older and deeper, loyalty earned the hard way. "We roll in 5, Briggs called out, not shouting but not asking either, and the men moved with purpose, boots hitting concrete in a rhythm that echoed off the cinder block walls. One of the younger specialists, a lanky kid named Morales, jogged up beside him with a question in his eyes, but Briggs cut him off gently. "This isn't about retaliation," he said. "It's about presence. We're not there to fight, we're there to stand. Understand?" Morales nodded, his face tight, with something between focus and disbelief, the kind that comes when the stories you've heard about someone suddenly collide with the reality of watching that someone get treated like less than human. The convoy moved out in silence, the engines humming low their bulk, chewing up asphalt with mechanical grace, 20 tons of steel and purpose winding down the back roads that led to Route 8. Inside the lead vehicle, Briggs kept his eyes on the map, not because he didn't know where he was going, but because it gave his hands something to do while his mind ran laps around the image of Wade bleeding in the sunlight, head bowed not in surrender but in control. The radio remained mostly quiet, except for short updates from the scouts ahead, confirming the road was clear, no sign of resistance or local law enforcement interference, at least not yet. The fields outside blurred into a patchwork of green and brown, but inside the Humvee time moved slow, each minute stretching into something heavy and breathless, like the calm before a storm no one had asked for, but everyone felt coming. Back at the scene, Officer Callahan had grown louder, not with volume but with intent, his movements sharper, more invasive, as if Wade's silence was provoking him in a way he couldn't tolerate. He paced around the motorcycle like a man looking for guilt in chrome and leather, pulling open compartments without asking, tossing aside personal items with a kind of practiced carelessness. Ross stood a few feet away, arms crossed, and eyes darting from his partner to the man they'd detained, something sour twisting in his gut each time Callahan pushed a little further, past what even he knew was protocol. He wanted to say something, had opened his mouth twice now, but the words stuck in his throat, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge that breaking rank came with a cost, and he hadn't yet decided who he was willing to pay it for. Wade, for his part, remained still, not because he was defeated, but because he'd learned long ago that movement could be mistaken for resistance, and resistance could become justification in the wrong man's hands. His wrists throbbed in the cuffs, blood still warm against his temple, but it was the quiet erosion of dignity that hurt more, the way Callahan sneered at the folded flag he'd carried for years, or how the younger officer wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. He closed his own for a second, just long enough to center himself, to recall the calm of parade formations, the weight of command, the sound of boots in rhythm and hearts in sync. And then through the stillness came the sound, low at first, like a rumble beneath the earth, the kind of vibration you feel in your spine before your ears catch up. Sarah Chen looked up from her phone, eyes widening, as she recognized the unmistakable roar of diesel engines in tight formation, growing louder by the second. Callahan paused mid-motion, his hand inside one of the saddlebags, head tilting slightly, as if trying to decode what he was hearing. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But Ross had already turned toward the road, his eyes narrowing as dust rose behind the trees at the edge of the bend. They came over the hill like a slow-moving wave of resolve, 15 Humvees in tight staggered formation, the lead vehicle cutting clean through the lane, followed by another and another, their headlights cutting through the morning haze with an almost cinematic symmetry. The engines didn't wail or roar, they growled a sound that didn't scream threat but certainty. Callahan stepped back instinctively, hand brushing the grip of his weapon, but not pulling his instincts, suddenly outmatched by something bigger than his badge. Ross whispered almost involuntarily, "That's military," as the lead vehicle slowed and pulled to a halt exactly 30 yards from the scene, its brakes hissing softly like a final breath before something important. No one stepped out right away. The engines idled in unison, their rhythmic hum filling the space with a pressure that made the air feel heavier, like the weight of hundreds of unspoken decisions had just arrived in a single formation. Wade opened his eyes, turned his head slightly, and saw them not with surprise, but with the calm recognition of a man who understood that sometimes, when you've lived a certain way long enough, the people you trained don't need to be told when it's time to show up. And just before the door of the lead Humvee opened, before a single boot hit the gravel, Elliot Wade, bleeding, bound but unbroken, straightened his spine and waited, not for rescue but for the return of balance. The door of the lead Humvee opened with a low mechanical clunk, the kind of sound that announces not force but finality, and from inside stepped Captain Aaron Briggs' boots, landing on the gravel with deliberate precision, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable, eyes locked on the man who stood cuffed and bleeding beside a sheriff's cruiser, like he didn't belong to the road he had once taught others to walk with pride. He didn't speak right away. There was no need to fill the moment with words when presence could do the work more cleanly, and behind him, like shadows, sharpening into form, 20 soldiers moved into silent formation, not aggressive, not armed, just aligned and alert, their faces, calm but focused, like a line drawn in the dirt with nothing left to say, except, "We see you." Callahan shifted instinctively his stance, tightening right hand, brushing the edge of his holster again, not drawing, not quite, but the kind of nervous motion that betrayed how completely the script had flipped without warning. He looked at Briggs like a man trying to reassert control through posture alone, but it was clear to everyone present that the ground had shifted under his feet, and no amount of bluster would hold it in place. Ross stood frozen, his eyes bouncing between Briggs-Wade and the slowly tightening arc of soldiers, something loosening in his chest that felt almost like relief, though he didn't know why. Briggs stepped forward until he stood just beyond the patrol car's front bumper, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You're detaining Sergeant Major Elliot Wade," he said, not asking, just naming the fact with a weight that didn't invite contradiction. 30 years U.S. Army, Silver Star, 4 deployments, trainer of thousands. He paused, let the wind rustle the leaves behind him, and added, "And my mentor." Callahan blinked once, trying to shape a response, with a mouth suddenly dry, but no words came, only a sputter that vanished into the tension like steam off hot metal. "This is a police matter," Callahan said, finally grasping for authority, but even he seemed to hear the hollowness of it as it left his lips. "You have no jurisdiction here." Briggs nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, voice steady as he answered, "We're not here for jurisdiction, we're here for clarity. And to ensure a man's dignity doesn't bleed out on the side of a road he paid to protect." His eyes flicked toward Wade, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but who now stood straighter somehow, as if the arrival of those he once shaped had reminded his body of its old geometry. The silence held for a beat too long, stretching into something that felt like judgment, until Sarah Chen stepped out of her car phone, still recording, her voice calm but firm. "Thousands of people are watching this," she said, "and they know who he is now." Her words didn't carry threat, only fact, and the sound of them seemed to slice through whatever illusion of control Callahan had left. "Unlock the cuffs," Briggs said, turning back to Callahan, not a demand, but a command delivered without edge, because edge wasn't needed when history was already standing in the room beside you. Callahan hesitated long enough to betray the tug-of-war happening inside him, but eventually reached for his keyring with fingers that weren't quite steady. He stepped behind Wade, inserted the key, and the metallic click of the cuffs unlocking echoed louder than it should have, like the release of a knot that had been too tight for too long. Wade brought his arms forward, slowly rotating his wrists once, twice, blood crusted at the edges of the abrasions, but his expression didn't change. He didn't thank anyone. He didn't speak. He just breathed in deeply, like a man remembering what it felt like to have space around his ribs again. Briggs stepped beside him, then not touching, just standing close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned. "You all right, sir?" he asked quietly. Wade nodded once. "I'm standing. That's enough for now." Behind them, Ross approached slowly, guilt written all over his face, hands open at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. "I should have stopped it," he said, voice low. "I knew it wasn't right." Wade turned to him, expression calm but direct. "Knowing isn't enough," he replied. "You have to choose what kind of man you are when nobody's watching." In the distance, sirens began to rise, slow at first, then sharper as local units, and eventually the sheriff's SUV came speeding down the hill, dust kicking up in swirls as the vehicles braked hard along the roadside. Sheriff Donald Harris stepped out, a man in his late 50s with a gut full of nerves and a mouthful of apologies before he even reached the scene. "What in God's name is going on here?" he asked, voice somewhere between disbelief and desperation, his eyes scanning the soldiers, the cameras, and the crowd now forming at a distance. "You tell us," Briggs answered, not confrontational but grounded, letting the presence of the men behind him do the speaking. Sheriff Harris turned toward Wade, then recognition dawning in his eyes like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Sergeant Major Wade," he asked, more breath than question. Wade nodded once, and the sheriff's face folded in on itself like something heavy had dropped behind his ribs. "Jesus," he whispered. "I didn't know. I didn't—" "But he did," Sarah Chen said, raising her phone slightly, catching Callahan in the frame. He looked at him, and he still didn't see him. The sheriff glanced at her, then at Callahan, who had taken 3 full steps backward and now stood half-shadowed by the open door of his cruiser, silent as a man realizing too late that the ground he stood on had always been made of sand. Sheriff Harris turned back to Wade, swallowed hard, and said, "You have my apology. We'll make this right." Wade looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Start by doing more than apologizing when a camera's running." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because truth, when it's lived, doesn't shout, it simply refuses to flinch. Briggs turned slightly toward his men, gave a single nod, and in a quiet ripple, the soldiers lowered their stance. A collective breath exhaled into a sky that was just beginning to clear. No banners, no fanfare, just a man reclaiming his breath, his ground, and a silence finally free of humiliation. 3 weeks after that Sunday morning on Route 8, the sky above Oak Ridge carried the same soft light. It had the day. Everything changed. Though now it seemed gentler somehow, as if the land itself had begun to exhale after holding its breath too long. The road was dry, the air crisp with the edge of early autumn, and the leaves, those slow-turning storytellers, had begun shifting to burnt oranges and deep reds, like they too remembered. At the edge of Pine Hollow, a familiar low rumble echoed out across the rolling hills, not a roar of rage or protest, but the steady sound of 200 motorcycles, moving as one engine's thrumming like a single heartbeat carried by chrome and resolve. Elliot Wade sat atop his Triumph, the same bike they'd tried to make him dismount with force and assumption, now cleaned, tuned, and shining faintly in the morning light. His helmet rested on the handlebar gloves tucked beneath his elbow, and his eyes, always alert, but never anxious, traced the faces gathering around him. They were veterans and civilians, young riders with slick new bikes and older ones, with boots that bore more miles than their tires, black, white, Latino, and everything in between, men and women who'd shown up not because they were told to, but because something deep in their bones said they had to. He didn't ask for the ride, didn't organize the route, and didn't speak much during the days that followed the incident. But the messages poured in like river water breaching its banks, quiet thank yous, shared memories, old soldiers hadn't heard from in decades, suddenly calling to say they saw what happened, and they hadn't forgotten the man who used to tell them posture first, clarity second, voice third. If they don't hear you, they better feel you stand. And now here they were ready to ride beside him, not to retaliate, not to make noise, but to remind the road who it belonged to, and to reclaim what was stolen in that silent hour between suspicion and recognition. His daughter Monica stood a few feet away, dressed in civilian clothes. Now, though her bearing still, carried the sharp angles of command hands in her pockets, eyes watching him the way only daughters do when they've been afraid, but won't say it aloud. She didn't speak until he walked the bike gently forward, helmet in hand, pausing beside her before climbing on. "You sure about this, Daddy?" she asked, voice low, not uncertain, just concerned. He gave her a small smile, the kind that meant everything and nothing at once. "Yeah," he said. "I've been riding these roads since you were in diapers. Feels good to ride them with company for once." She placed a hand on the tank, let it rest there for a second like she was anchoring herself to the moment, then stepped back as he swung one leg over the saddle. The Triumph kicked to life with that familiar low growl, the kind that doesn't demand attention but commands it anyway, and slowly, without signal or speech, the riders began to move 2 by 2 down the hill and toward Route 8. As they approached the intersection near the creek, the place where he'd been pulled over, cuffed and pressed against cold metal, no one pointed, no one cheered, and no one stopped. The sound of the engines lowered to a respectful hush, as if even the machines understood that silence sometimes carries more than 1,000 slogans ever could. Elliot looked to his left, then his right, saw dozens of faces looking forward, not at him, and he nodded once, a simple gesture that passed down the line like wind in wheat. Half a mile farther, parked near the county line, stood a familiar figure in jeans and a black riding jacket, arms crossed, eyes low. Deputy Liam Ross, no badge, no cruiser, just his own battered Honda waiting beside the fence line. When the convoy slowed and Elliot pulled near, Ross stepped forward, helmet in hand, not hiding but not quite knowing where he belonged either. Elliot Brake gently lifted his visor and looked at the younger man without judgment, just long enough for Ross to speak first. "I came to say I'm sorry," Ross said, voice steady but quiet, "for not stepping in sooner, for staying silent when I knew better." Elliot let the moment breathe before answering, his voice calm but rooted. "Apologies are cheap if you don't do something with them," he said. "You show up, that's a start." Ross nodded, his throat working once, then extended his hand not as a gesture of closure but as a beginning. Elliot shook it firmly, then offered a second nod. "Ride with us," he said simply. "Not in front, not behind, just in line." Ross nodded again, mounted his bike, and joined the column as it continued east. By the time they reached the town square, folks had gathered quietly. Families with lawn chairs, teenagers with phones, elders with folded arms and knowing eyes. And when Elliot and the riders passed, no one cheered but many stood. An old man saluted. A young woman placed her hand over her heart. No spectacle, no flash, just the raw, quiet language of respect when it's finally been earned back the hard way. Later that afternoon, Elliot sat under the oak tree behind his house, boots off, feet in the grass, a glass of iced tea sweating on the table beside him. Monica sat nearby, flipping through photos people had sent from the ride, her face softening with each image. "You know you didn't have to forgive him," she said at one point, not accusing, just reflecting. Elliot looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to melt behind the ridge, and said, "Forgiveness isn't for them. It's how we decide whether today carries yesterday's weight or tomorrow's hope." She smiled at that, half proud, half resigned, and leaned back in her chair, the sounds of the cicadas rising like applause in the trees. The road hadn't changed. The bike hadn't changed. But something in the way Elliot Wade now moved through the world had firmer, freer, not louder, just harder to ignore. And maybe that's how change really starts, not in the courtroom or the headline, but in the quiet way a man refuses to bow, rides again, and doesn't ride alone. What happened to Elliot Wade wasn't just about a traffic stop, it was about the quiet ways dignity can be stripped from a man, and the louder ways a community can come together to return it. This story reminds us that respect should never be something a person has to earn through medals, titles, or sacrifice. It should be the starting point of every interaction, not a reward held back by bias or fear. Elliot didn't fight back with anger, but with silence, composure, and the weight of a life lived in service to others. And in that silence, others found their voice: soldiers, neighbors, strangers, and even those who once stood by doing nothing. We learned that real strength doesn't always look like shouting or pushing back. It can look like standing tall while being handcuffed, or shaking the hand of the man who failed to protect you. And we're reminded that accountability doesn't just belong in courtrooms, it belongs in everyday choices, from the way we treat each other to the courage we show when we choose to speak up. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the value of quiet courage, of service, of standing for something bigger than yourself, then please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Because sometimes the most powerful change begins not with a bang, but with the steady sound of wheels on a road, and a man who refuses to stop riding forward.